Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil and this is Nashville. I'm willing to bet if you're listening right now, you know the name Jad Abumrad. Let's face it, he's one of the folks who pioneered podcasting and a new innovative approach to audio storytelling. I remember the first time I heard Radiolab. I was mesmerized by how they played with sound to convey a compelling story. I thought I had discovered something new and started telling all of my friends. Turns out they were already fans and I was late to the game. More recently, he co-created and hosted the WNYC podcast, Dolly, Parton's America. Later this hour, Jad Abumrad joins us to talk podcasting and what's next for him. But first, it's time for At Us. Each week, we take time to read the comments so you don't have to. Yes, I am encouraging you to literally at us on Twitter at This Is Nashville and on Instagram at ThisIsNashville_WPLN. Joining me now with a look back at the past week is our digital lead, Anna Gallegos-Cannon. Hey, Anna.
Hey, Khalil. Good to be in the studio.
Good to have you in the studio. Okay, so let's get right to it. After last week's episode about Black churches, I understand we received an interesting Instagram message that connected that show to other segments we had, right?
Yes. Rebecca Hendon DM'd us to say, quote, I recently listened to the episode on Black churches in Middle Tennessee, and it led me to thinking about the legacy of Black education in Nashville. We are blessed to still have Fisk, TSU, and American Baptist, but it is worth remembering the others that have graced our city. One in particular was Nashville Christian Institute, which was a Black boarding school in Nashville. Civil rights lawyer Fred Gray and numerous other people who have influenced our world went there. Also, she writes, the last remaining building for NCI is in danger of being demolished due to development, and perhaps if more people knew about it, it could be saved. Well, NCI may sound familiar to our listeners because we briefly mentioned the last remaining building that Rebecca wrote about in a previous segment on the Nashville 9.
In late November, WPLN Special Projects editor Tony Gonzalez came on to talk about these priorities of these properties of the historic Nashville Incorporated. He says they're at risk of disappearing. The NCI building is actually an old gym in North Nashville that is now up for sale. What else are our listeners talking about?
One listener was inspired to share the story of his autism diagnosis with us while listening to Monday's show. D.T. Roth said, quote, I am now 68 years old and was treated for what became known as ADHD by taking Ritalin in the 60s. I did not realize I was autistic until I was in my mid-40s.
You know, a lot more people have been coming up with that. They've been saying that. Interesting. What else?
Well, we received a really curious comment from someone outside of Nashville during our episode about New Year's resolutions for the city. So during that show, our guest, Phil Michael Thomas, said that he was concerned about how a proposed increase to the hotel tax will impact locals who are staying in hotels and motels as short-term housing. In response to Phil's comment, Philip Ferreira from Portland, Maine, tweeted at us to say, quote, not sure how it works in Nashville, but unhoused people generally get vouchers paid for by the municipality or state. These vouchers are paid for by taxpayers, so the hotel tax increase shouldn't matter to the unhoused. Hope it works like that in Nashville, too.
Well, I mean, does it? Is there something like this in Nashville?
So I wanted to know, so I looked into it. And during the height of the pandemic, the city did use federal CARES funding for hotel vouchers for the unhoused. Local nonprofits like Room at the Inn and the Rescue Mission will sometimes have hotel vouchers too, but that's like you got to contact them directly. But I really think Phil's comment was more about people who are living in motels because they have low credit scores or they're low income, so it makes it difficult to find an apartment.
Which makes affordable housing much more of a priority for our town. All right, what else we got?
So during Tuesday's episode about streetcars, someone who goes by @nickel-and-dime tweeted at us saying, quote, not having rail service in and around Nashville is so sad and a huge missed opportunity. One day people will look back at our car-dependent culture the way we now look back at open sewers and widespread smoking, an obviously unhealthy and ridiculous state of things. And you know what? 60 years from now, we should totally revisit that comment.
Speaking of 60 years, WPLN is celebrating its anniversary. We'll have a special episode about it tomorrow.
And of course, we're planning to include listener voices. So listeners, if you have a favorite story or just want to share how long you've been listening to the station, write us or leave us a voice message at thisisnashville.org. We really want to hear your WPLN stories.
Thanks to our digital lead, Anna Gallegos-Cannon, for this roundup. Anna, we'll see you soon.
Of course. And our listeners know where to find me online.
Don't forget to add us on Twitter and Instagram, and let's keep the comments coming. Also, fill out our community survey to let us know what topics you want us to cover at thisisnashville.org. It is super easy and quick and helps us produce shows with your needs and interests in mind. We have to take a short break. When we come back, founder and former host of Radiolab, Jad Abumrad, will join us. We'll learn how the Nashville native and son of a Vanderbilt surgeon went on to launch an epic radio career in New York City. Tweet us your questions for Jad at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Colonna, and this is Nashville. The syndicated radio show and podcast Radiolab from WNYC is one of the world's most beloved and downloaded shows. It's one that started as an idea some 20 years ago to tackle science and philosophy with human interest style stories. It leaned on curiosity and, above all else, sound.
Oh, wait, you're listening?
Okay.
All right.
Oh, okay. You're listening to Radiolab on New York Public Radio, WNYC. Now?
On New York Public Radio.
Public Radio, WNYC.
On New York Public Radio.
Public Radio, WNYC.
Keep listening. Okay.
Okay, so the other day, should we say who we are?
Yeah, I guess we should.
Okay, Jad.
Robert.
Radiolab. Okay, so the other day, Soren called us into the studio.
There they are. Oh!
It's an iconic intro, and of course, that voice you hear is Jad Abumrad. In 2011, he was the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Award. And in addition to creating and hosting Radiolab for 17 years, he also created the podcast More Perfect, co-produced the miniseries Dolly Parton's America, and The Vanishing of Harry Pace. And he joins me now. Jad Abumrad, welcome to This Is Nashville.
Hey, thanks, Khalil, for having me on. I'm so excited to be here.
Really appreciate you being with us, my friend. So let's start with the big question. How are you?
This is a big question these days, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man. You know, neuroscience teaches us that we are not one unified self. We are just a bundle of contradictory selves and thought patterns. And I never have felt that more viscerally than now. I am many things, one of which is like, fine, but the other is fretting about the state of America, the state of the world. So I'm a lot of things, but I think I can all sort of, I can summarize it all by saying, I'm doing okay. Happy to be here. Let's just like anchor there. Really happy to be here. Nashville's my hometown, and it's amazing to be talking to you.
Yeah, it's really great to have you. And what you just expressed, I feel very closely. It's almost as if I said it, I answered the question for myself. So, talk to us. Your breakthrough into the hearts and minds of podcast listeners was with Radiolab, which launched nearly 20 years ago. But I want to go back a little bit further than that. How did you first get your start in radio?
Oh, wow. Yeah, let's see. I mean, that's let me see if I can edit a succinct version of that story as I tell it. I thought I would be a musician. That was my life plan. I was telling one of your producers earlier that my formative years in Nashville were spent in a practice room at Blair School of Music, just playing scales. I was that kid, right? So
Okay.
I went to school, college, came out of college thinking I would somehow be a film composer. Tried that for a little bit, ended up being terrible at it and failing. And then in one of those very sort of typical post-college flails, what am I going to do with my life? Oh, I'm going nowhere. I'm a failure. In one of those moments, my then girlfriend, now wife, Carla Murthy, who herself is an amazing documentary maker, she had just gone to a conference where she saw this hack called Ira Glass give a talk.
Okay.
I say that lovingly because he's a friend.
Yes.
She'd seen him give a talk and he inspired her. And so she came back and she said, maybe you should make some radio because it's kind of music like what you like to do. I know you like to write, so it's kind of that. And it was just a weird from left field idea at that point. And so I thought, well, okay, how do people get into making radio? Well, let me go volunteer at a community radio station. And I was living in New York City at the time, and WBI Radio was this incredible progressive radio station in the belly of Wall Street. And I ended up just volunteering for that place and doing random news reporting when they'd let me, working on a politics show. And I just fell in love with the whole thing of live radio. One of your pictures earlier was talking about just sort of the magic and the energy of live radio. And that's real, just like pulling all of these ideas and sounds together in this moment. I just completely got hooked. And so I just stayed around as long as they let me, and then eventually ended up getting a job, like a proper job at WNYC, which is the public radio station in New York City. And happened to be in the hall when they had an idea to change their schedule and to create spaces for shows like, drum roll please, Radiolab. And I just happened to be standing in the right place at the right time, and I got a really lucky break. And the rest is history.
Okay, so what was your pitch in the hall when you serendipitously walked into that meeting? How'd you pitch him?
I mean, I think the pitch was that it was 2002, so it was early 2002, and this is a little bit of a sort of wonky New York history, but basically, so 9/11, sort of September 11, 2001 had just happened, and the New York City station to that point had been all music, and suddenly this international event happens literally 2 blocks from the station, and the antenna went down, and there was this big listener campaign to resurrect the station, which they did. But as a consequence, all of the listeners now didn't want to hear music; they wanted to hear news. So the station completely transformed their schedule, and they opened up all of these spaces, and they said, we want to create spaces where people can hear documentaries from around the world. And I sort of raised my hand, and I was like, well, I can do that. Let me create sort of a blank 3-hour space where some of the best radio reporting and documentary making from London, from Zimbabwe, from the Netherlands, from Australia, all of these places that had really long and rich radio traditions. What if I take all that stuff and kind of almost mash it up and play like 10 minutes of this and 10 minutes of that, and lead people through a kind of kaleidoscope of the kinds of stories that are being told elsewhere? Because that's what listeners wanted at that point. We didn't just want to hear pretty music or what's happening just in New York, because we had all been smacked in the face by the reality that New York was now the center of the world for a minute.
Yeah.
And we didn't know why, and we wanted to know why. So that was my basic pitch. I mean, it was a really easy pitch at that time. And then the show morphed slowly into something like what you described in your intro. But that was a couple of years before we really hit on that.
Did you know As you were going through these 2 years of kind of morphing and shaping this weird show, did you know that it would grow into what it is today, something that's lasted for nearly 20 years?
Oh no. Oh God, no. I mean, no. I mean, and I don't know that I ever had time to think about it. Because I got into, I mean, I was stuck into the host seat, and it really wasn't just the host seat. It was the host, producer, engineer, researcher seat, because I was doing everything.
Okay.
I was, even in those early days, I would make the show literally in the basement of the house that I'm in now. I would race on my bike across the Brooklyn Bridge, run up the 20 flights of stairs to get to the control room, stick the CD in right before it was supposed to broadcast. And then as it was broadcasting, I would come in and do the weather. So I was even doing the weather.
Wow.
To the whole, I was doing the whole thing. And at that time, it was just so much to do. I had to fill 3 hours every week. And I didn't really know what I was doing, Khalil. I mean, I didn't know how to sound on the radio. Like you have a beautiful sonorous voice, right? And that, maybe you were born with it, or maybe that was something that you had to sort of work at to kind of figure out, like, who am I on the radio? Because it's slightly different than who you are in real life, right? It's
a little bit, I will say. And thank you for the compliment.
It's a slightly different thing, I had to learn who I was on the radio. I had to learn, how do you report something? I don't know. I hadn't gone to journalism school. What does it mean? How do you fact check? How the hell does that work? Right. So I had to learn all of those things. And so it was, I had to learn on the job, basically. And which was the best and most terrifying way of learning. Okay.
Well, we're all happy that you learned, and you learned quickly. Radiolab is famous for using sound design to illustrate complex scientific principles and break them down for the listener. There was an episode from 2015 on CRISPR, which is a method for genetic manipulation. We're going to listen to a clip from that episode. Here you're talking about how Japanese scientists were reading genetic code for E. coli.
E. coli are bacteria inside humans, and like all living things, E. coli is made up of DNA, A's and T's and C's and G's, and what happened was that these scientists were reading a chunk of that genetic code when
they found this really strange stretch of DNA.
Strange how?
Well, so basically what it was 5 identical sequences in a row. And then they were separated by very short sequences in between them that were all different from each other.
These little blurps would be like.
And they looked at this and they're like, what? This is nothing like we've seen before.
Repeated sequences in bacterial genomes are kind of unusual.
It just feels to me like you guys had a lot of fun doing the sound effects for that. Tell me, how did you find that using that kind of sound design effects, how does that affect the storytelling process?
I think it's a little bit, it's born of a problem that you're trying to solve, right? Like, for example, something like what we just heard in the CRISPR. Like, CRISPR is typically how scientists sort of engage with the information of CRISPR is by looking at genetic printouts of the sequence, which are just streams and streams of letters, which don't mean anything to the normal person. But they're seeing some kind of pattern there. And so the question always is, okay, can we as reporters, and can we get our listeners to experience the information in a way that feels exciting and visceral, but also doesn't dumb it down, right? So it's like you're always trying to sort of like use the sound almost as like audio data visualizations. And so I feel like the sound, it exists as two things at once in the world of Radiolab and all my work. It's hopefully helping you enter the story. It's creating little audio metaphors that actually demystify the information. And so like it's teaching you something. And so it's very, very specifically didactic. At the same time, it's sort of artful, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never call it art, but I hope that it sounds like aesthetically like it's also sound for its own sake. but it's never one at the expense of the other, right? It's always like, we're not making sound art. We're really trying to communicate, but I also want it to be beautiful if I can. And so it's, the sound does two things at once for me. And, it's funny. I mean, a lot of what this is sort of one of the sound design secrets of the show, is that often we would use the words of our interviews to create the sounds. For example, that was Carl Zimmer that you heard talking in an interview. I can remember very specific moments where I would take Carl's voice and deconstruct the actual words into just sort of like tiny particles of sound that you could then multiply and manipulate to create bleeps and bloops and drones and various kinds of textures. And I loved those kinds of experiments, like actually literally creating music out of the voices, as if the music emerged from inside the voices. I don't know. I mean, that's just like the music part of me that's always just really turned on by that stuff. But at the end of the day, it really is about communicating something to people and making sure it really comes across, not as information, but as some kind of experience.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil. My guest this hour is Radiolab founder and former host, Jad Abumrad. Now, to me, listening to Radiolab is kind of like listening to jazz. You have to train your ear to hear it. Miles Davis talked about the beauty of the space in between the notes. I think Radiolab uses space in that same way. And you just said it, you wanted to make something beautiful. Tell me, how did your musical background impact the way you approached producing these episodes?
Well, I love that you just likened it to jazz, because very often I would, like Robert and I, when he became co-host with me, we would often think about ourselves as a duet in a jazz kind of context, and also how we were duetting with the sounds. Like it felt almost like sometimes like a trio in a way. But a very sort of edited and manufactured one. But, I think my music background, to your question, I went to a very weird music school called Oberlin, and I was a composing major at Oberlin. And I didn't know this when I showed up, but Oberlin had been taken over by a sort of leftover lefties from the avant-garde. These are people who were doing like really like just taking the sort of like the romantic, pretty music of the 19th century and just trying to break it into something dissonant and noisy. Literally one of the first piano recitals that I saw was a senior thesis of, he was sawing his piano in half with a chainsaw.
Wow.
Like that was his performance. So that was the culture at Oberlin, right? It was a very kind of experimental, like, let's just tear it all down kind of place. And initially I walked into that and I was like, what nightmare have I wandered into? Get me out of here. But then I actually kind of grew to it, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. Like there's, it's fun to try and play with sounds and experiment. And I never wanted to like hurt people with the sound. I actually wanted to seduce people with the sound, but I loved the sort of experimentation that was happening. So when I got into radio through the side door, one of the first things I would do was just to try and bring some of those weird experimental music concrete instincts into the production of radio, really just because I didn't know any better. I didn't have a long sense of history about what radio was or what's expected. I was just like, oh, this would be neat. Let's try this. Oh, this is fun. Let's try this little weird noise. And I think in the process, I think radio, it's a very particular historical window. These days you hear so many different sounds and types of music on podcasts and on the radio. But at the time, it really was just All Things Considered, and this new show called This American Life that had just launched. But there wasn't a whole lot between them. And so when I started playing with sound the way that I did, I just think it registered to people as something very different. I don't know that it would now, I think it would just be, part of the scrum. So maybe I got lucky a little bit, just that came up at a specific moment.
I think we all got lucky. Earlier this year, you retired from Radiolab. How does it feel to leave that big part of your life behind?
It feels like, sort of getting back to the very first thing I said, it feels like so many things, you know. I feel so proud of what I created selfishly, but also like those people that I worked with. Soren Wheeler, who was my right hand for a decade and plus, you know, who's now the sort of lead editorial on the show. Like, he and I worked so intimately together, and I'm so proud of him. I'm so proud of those hosts, Lulu and Latif, who are like my radio children, you know. They are incredible, and they're going to take the show in new places. And the entire producing staff, they're so smart. They're just so smart. I left at a time when they were doing things that I actually was like, that I felt like they'd raced past me in a lot of ways. So there's pride. There's also a little bit of like, oh, I miss, it's like, it was so, like, to live a life inside the production of a show. I mean, I'm sure you can speak to this. It simplifies your life in such a, like, you get up, got to make the show. You go to bed.
Yeah.
Get up, got to make the show. And it can be a little bit grueling. It can grind people into dust. And part of the reason I left was just I was so tired of working all-nighters, right? But it also gives your life a kind of structure. And I miss that structure a little bit. At the same time, I find it exhilarating to be in this like open-ended beginner's mind state, and to get to spend more time with my kids, who are just like delightful and about to, you know, one of them's about to go to high school, another one's in 6th grade. And it's just like amazing to sort of see them evolve and develop as humans. And it's also exciting to be at a place where I can create new projects. So it's a lot of things at once, Khalil, but mostly I'd say I'm just happy that the show is living on and flourishing.
We have to take a short break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Nashville's own Jad Abumrad, founder of Radiolab. We'll learn what he's up to now and how his relationship with Dolly Parton helped him see the world differently. Do you have a question for Jad Abumrad? Tweet us at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back. I'm Khalil Ekalona, and this is Nashville. My guest this hour is Jad Abumrad, creator and former host of the podcast Radiolab. He's also the co-producer of the 2019 miniseries Dolly Parton's America, a project that brought the Nashville native back to his roots. Jad Abumrad, thanks again for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So, Dolly Parton, she's Nashville royalty. Yeah,
I know. It's partly why I decided to make a 12-part series about her is that she defined my childhood in a way. I mean, without really ever knowing her music too intimately, she was just everywhere. She kind of fuses the air. And I think it was even more so when I was growing up. So in trying to talk to her and create a series about her that was really about America as seen through her. That was a lot of that was me wrestling with Nashville and what Nashville meant to me, and how I feel about the South and some of these questions. So yeah, it was the most personal project I ever did, even though it was actually about Dolly. But she is a hard to summarize.
Yes.
And just pretty much straight up amazing.
True definition of an icon. Now, let's get into your background more. When did your family first move to Music City?
We moved in 1977, 78. So I was 4 or 5 when we moved. I do remember, I mean, the vaguest of memories, and my dad sort of confirmed this for me. I remember we moved during the hostage crisis, and Nashville's become a very different place, and mostly in great ways. But one of my first experiences of Nashville was somebody throwing a rock through the window because they thought we were somehow part of, like, we're Lebanese. We weren't involved in the hostage crisis at all.
Yeah.
But I remember that was those kinds of incidents, few and far between, colored my idea of what Nashville was and my place in it. And I think unfairly to Nashville, because as I return to Nashville, I see such a different place, such a much more diverse and interesting and nuanced and wonderful place. Yeah, but at the time in 78, 79, it didn't feel that way to me. It felt like we were interlopers.
Well, as you were growing up here as a young Lebanese boy, how did you perceive Nashville back then?
I perceived Nashville as a gosh, I thought of it as, it's funny. It's an interesting question because I don't know that I perceived it in any one way. Most of what I perceived was how I was perceived. I was a sort of a shy kid, and it took me a long, long time to find my confidence as a human. And so I was always measuring, like, how am I seen in this room and how am I seen in that room? And mostly I saw myself as somehow, like, I remember there were times when I was, I hope this isn't much of a downer, but this is just like a memory. I remember, all right, fourth graders, raise your hands. Who here goes to church? Everyone raised their hands but me. And I thought, oh my God, I need to go to church. Like, that's what people do here. And I remember that just my name tripped people up, and it was just it all seems so stupid now. And it all seems so quaint. But I do remember, like, being perceived as just a curiosity, and seeing Nashville as a place where a very settled white community that loved country music kind of was happy to be what it was and not to necessarily have people coming in. But even as I was there, it changed. Even as what was interesting was that I was also, I spent most of my time at Vanderbilt. My after school program was just hanging out in my parents' lab or at the Blair School of Music. And these were very international spaces. So I could also see, I could see that there were different Nashvilles. There was the Nashville of the healthcare system, which was, you had Vietnamese people, you had Nigerian people, you had Laotian people, all kinds of different people come to work in these labs. And then you had, like, where I went to school, which was not that, So no, sorry, I'm spinning myself into a cul-de-sac here, but it was I don't know that I had a perception of Nashville. I was intimately aware of how I was seen, and that there were different pockets where the city was different.
Now, did you ever develop, did your desire to leave Nashville come from, being aware of how you were seen and not necessarily feeling embraced by the city?
Yeah, I think a little bit for sure. And I don't want to underline that too much, because, my experience in Nashville is pretty good by comparison to, but yeah, I remember when I left Nashville, I left with a very particular story in my head about the place I was leaving. And I'm not sure it was a fair story or it was the right story, but I remember leaving Nashville and being really happy I'd left and moving to New York. And as unfortunately New Yorkers are wont to do, then looking down on the South, and I felt like I'd earned the right to do that. And it was funny, the Dolly series was my chance to rewrite that story in my head and to really look at the South with new eyes. At a time when so many people are doing that, so many people are moving back to the South and reclaiming the stories and finding that the South actually is for them as much as anyone. And so I used that series as an opportunity to completely reformat my ideas of Nashville, my ideas of the South, and also my ideas of my own childhood in that one endeavor.
With Dolly Parton's America, that's the project that brought you way back to your roots. And in 2020, you gave a TED Talk about, you shared this memory that you sort of had this epiphany when visiting Dolly's childhood mountain home. Let's take a listen to that.
And coming back from that trip on the mountain, a friend of mine gave me a book that gave this whole idea a name. In psychotherapy, there's this idea called the third, which essentially goes like this. Typically, we think of ourselves as these autonomous units. I do something to you, you do something to me. But according to this theory, when two people come together and really commit to seeing each other, in that mutual act of recognition, they actually make something new, a new entity that is their relationship. You can think of Dolly's concerts as sort of a cultural third space. The way she sees all the different parts of her audience, the way they see her, creates the spiritual architecture of that space. And I think now that is my calling. That as a journalist, as a storyteller, as just an American living in a country struggling to hold, that every story I tell has got to find the third. That place where the things we hold as different resolve themselves into something new.
That epiphany had to be pretty heavy, transformative, and cathartic for you. You came back to the South, of which you had feelings about. And though, through these conversations with Dolly, through these connections you found, you were able to make connections to your own family and your own place in the South. How did the third really change the approach to your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's an idea that when I sort of, just for context, I really found it amazing the way that Dolly, both as a human, as a singular human, but also in the space that she creates at her concerts, could welcome in people who we're told in America hate each other, right? Dolly's concerts are famously a mashup of all these slices of America. I mean, you'll see women holding hands. You'll see little girls in coat of many colors shirts. You'll see men in trucker hats. You'll see Confederate flags on occasion. You'll see LGBTQ forward people. It's just like there's so many different kinds of people that that you don't find in the same space. And I was just really curious, like, how does she do that? The third became a way of explaining that there's a way in which when you insist on who you are and you hold your own differences, and yet you simultaneously insist on empathy for the person that you're speaking to. Jessica Benjamin, who I subsequently interviewed about the third, because this is her idea, she talks about, like, when you have agency and empathy in equal measure, what that does is it has two people together, but that creates a space between them, and they can use that space, they can fill it up with something new. They can create something together. And so how it's affected my work is I just think about that as an overarching goal that, we journalists tend to like difference. We tend to sort of fetishize difference because difference is tension, and tension is what makes stories go. Every story begins with a problem. This is what true crime is, right? Like within the first minute, someone is shot and died. And then the entire story is like, who shot the person? Yeah. So it's like you start with a problem, then you fix it, which is not the only way to do stories, I think. And so for me, it became a way to sort of rectify the inherent bias that we have towards difference and towards fetishizing difference, while at the same time not obliterating difference, because that also is a kind of crime, in my opinion. So, like, what was a way that you could hold difference, but also allow for something to happen that could feel an opening up? And so, I don't know, like I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit too sort of like abstract, but the short of it is that
I love it.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just have to ask you this real quick question about Vanderbilt. You are working with Vanderbilt to form this podcast institute set to launch in 2023. Tell us briefly what it looks like and what your vision is for the next generation of storytellers.
Yeah, well, right now I'm trying to figure that out. So I'm just preparing to teach my first classes. The idea that I have is, there's a generation of students that they've grown up on podcasts. They know the forms, they know all the the ways of telling stories. What they don't know is just how to do an interview, how to make sure something is true. And so what I'd like to do is to create classes where students can come, they learn the basics, the rudiments of the craft, but we do it in service of creating something that at the end of the class they'll be proud of, but also might be useful for society, right? So I'm partnering with different parts of Vanderbilt to I mean, you know, like I'm in conversation with a doctor right now who runs an OR, and he tells me that his patients often have questions. You know, the preoperative space is a really confusing environment with like lots of weird noises, and people are like telling you about anesthesia and you don't know what any of it means. So I'd like to create a class where I work with students to create stories for people in that space.
Wonderful.
So that they could hear, they could hit play on a player and then have their questions answered and also be calmed.
I got it. We have to end here. I wish we had more time. Jad Abumrad is the creator of Radiolab, co-producer of Dolly Parton's America, and he's come on board at Vanderbilt. Thank you so much for being with us. We have to do this again. We want to thank everybody who tuned in this hour. This is Nashville is a production of WPLN News and Nashville Public Radio. I'm Khalil. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody. Be good to each other.